Welcome to the part 4 of the International Christian University Linguistic Colloquium, as known as ICULINC, that is organized with the theme of Prosody this year. I'm Seunghun Lee from International Christian University, and today we have two exciting talks by Nicole Dehé from University of Konstanz and Adam Chong from Queen Mary University of London. Let me first introduce Professor Dehé, or Nicole. Nicole is a professor of general linguistics in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Konstanz in Germany. She's also adjunct professor in the Faculty of Icelandic and Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Iceland. Her current research focuses on the prosody and intonation of insular Scandinavian, namely Icelandic and Faroese. Also, the syntax-prosody interface in Icelandic and the syntax and prosody of North American Icelandic, so-called heritage Icelandic, as well as the prosody of rhetorical question and other utterance types in multiple European languages, as well as Mandarin Chinese. So it's good to have Nicole at ICULINC today. We will today hear about the prosodic marking of rhetorical questions, a cross-linguistic view. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction. I would like, before I start, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, especially Seunghun. Hello, very nice to meet you
Yes,
this occasion. Yes. and of course also your assistants. Thank you very much for inviting me, for having me here. It's exciting to be here. And I would like to talk about the prosodic marking of rhetorical questions, a cross-linguistic view. And before I start, I always have to say that this is all collaborative work coming out of our funded project on rhetorical questions, on the prosody of rhetorical questions, starting with German and then adding other languages. And you see my my co-PI, Bettina Braun, here, and then also our two PhD students and one postdoc who are working on the project. So this is just a roadmap. So I begin by giving you a very quick comparison of information-seeking questions and rhetorical questions in terms of semantics or meaning. And then I will give a quick introduction to syntactic and possible prosodic means to indicate rhetorical meaning before I take you to the studies, or some of the studies, 3 of the studies that we carried out in Konstanz. It's I hope that I will have time to go through all of them. I'm not sure that I will, but I'll try to. And then there will be a final discussion. So starting with questions, rhetorical questions. So rhetorical questions can have the same form syntactically as information-seeking questions. So if you have a polar question like, does anyone like lemons, or WH question like, who likes lemons, they can be used as either an information-seeking question or rhetorical question. And then, of course, other forms of interrogatives can also be used as rhetorical questions, but those are the 2 that we are going to look at today. So rhetorical questions are formally interrogatives, but they differ from information-seeking questions in discourse function. Now I can't, yeah. Okay, so in what ways do they differ? Biersma and Rawlins in their 2017 SALT paper indicate, based on the literature of course, indicate 3 main characteristics that rhetorical questions have. One is that they do not expect an answer. The second one is they have the feel of an assertion, and the third one is they do not have to, but they can optionally be answered. There is also, for information-seeking questions, there is a high degree of uncertainty as to the answer on the part of the speaker. That's why we are asking a question, because we are uncertain about something, so we want an answer as a speaker. But for rhetorical questions, there is no uncertainty, and instead the answer is already in the common ground and is already obvious to all interlocutors. And Biersma and Rawlins also say that rhetorical questions must conventionally indicate the speaker's attitude that the question they are asking is non-inquisitive in context. So that's the main differences, just very quickly, between information-seeking questions and rhetorical questions from a semantic point of view, or meaning-wise. Now, morpho-syntactic and lexical cues to rhetorical interpretations include quite a few means, quite a few cues. So, for example, we have these negative polarity items in A and B here, mentioned by Han in the literature, strong negative polarity items and weak negative polarity items, and they may indicate rhetorical meaning. Then from Japanese, we have this hearsay construction that has been mentioned in the literature that can indicate rhetorical meaning. We also, another example from Japanese, have non-referential use of the noun thing. So if you do that, you may indicate rhetorical meaning. Then from other languages like English or German, we know that you may use lexical elements like adverbials or particles to indicate rhetorical meaning. I'll explain the German example here. So, wer zahlt schon gerne Steuern? Schon is a particle. If you take that out, then the question may be information seeking. But if you have it in, then it's very likely a rhetorical question. So, who likes paying taxes? That's a rhetorical question if you have schon in there. Schon can also be a temporal adverbial, but then the pronunciation differs. There's also an example from Chinese here where you can also make use of particles. So we have morphosyntactic and lexical cues to rhetorical interpretation, but the question is, what happens if you don't have them? So if you have a string on the surface that doesn't have either any of these negative polarity items, any of the other means that I showed to you, then how do you arrive at a rhetorical interpretation as a listener, if that's what the speaker had in mind? Or as a speaker, what do you do to mark your rhetorical question as such? And of course, in oral language, in spoken language, you have prosodic cues that you can make use of. So possible cues are F0, related cues, temporal cues, or voice quality. And how do we know this? Well, we know that in intonation languages, for example, looking at F0 here, in intonation languages, pitch accents, for example, are being used in other contexts as well to mark elocution type or utterance type. So just to give you random examples here, in Icelandic, we know that pitch accent types distinguish between declaratives and WH questions and polar questions. In Italian, this goes back to work by D'Imperio 2000 for her dissertation, where she shows that pitch accents are responsible for the distinction between narrow focus statements and string identical polar questions. And as I said, this is just a random set of examples. We also make use of boundary tones, of course, rising versus falling, terminus of the utterance. And in tone languages, we have a we have a picture where we also make use of F0 to distinguish between utterance types. Of course, here the contour, the overall contour, is more constrained because of the shape of the tones, but you can still use F0 to distinguish between utterance types. So for example, it has been shown that F0 distinguishes between string identical declaratives and WH interrogatives. And it has also been shown that F0 distinguishes between string identical declaratives and polar interrogatives. So we get these differences there as well. And this is looking at global and also local properties of the F0 contour. So F0, we know that from the literature, is capable of distinguishing between utterance types or elocution types. The same is true for temporal cues like duration or speech rate. So for example, it has been shown already that questions are produced with faster speaking rate than statements in quite a few languages. And we also know that questions are generally shorter than declaratives in Chinese, a language that we are going to look at today. And then another phonetic parameter that has been shown to distinguish between utterance types is voice quality. So we know from the literature that breathier voice quality in declarative questions, for example, so we have breathier voice quality in declarative questions than in declarative statements in German. And breathiness has also been associated with questionhood in a number of African languages. So those cues, F0, temporal cues, and voice quality, are cues to meaning have been shown to be used to distinguish between utterance types or elocution types, between meanings of otherwise string identical sentences. So these are the cues, the prosodic cues that we decided to look at when we decided to study the prosody of rhetorical questions. So we are going to look in what follows at 4 languages that we studied in our own lab, maybe English, German, Icelandic, and Chinese. In the meantime, there has been a lot of work on other languages as well, including French and recently Estonian and other languages as well. But those are the 4 languages that we've been looking at in our own lab. So I'm now going to tell you about the 3 studies that I want to include in this presentation. So we started out with a production experiment testing the 4 languages that I just mentioned, namely German, English, Icelandic, and modern Chinese. Then I will tell you about a corpus study that we did for German, and if I have time, I will tell you about a syntax experiment, which I put into these in inverted commas here, because it's not only about syntax, and the analysis there is still in progress. So, as I said, we tested these 4 languages in our lab, and we did so in order to address at least 2 research questions. And one is just, well, one was really explorative in the beginning. What are the prosodic cues used by speakers to disambiguate between genuine questions, information-seeking questions on the one hand, and rhetorical questions on the other hand? And second, what are the differences and commonalities between these languages? So in how far are the prosodic cues that we can identify language specific, and in how far does the prosodic type of a language play a role? So for example, here, intonation languages like German and Icelandic versus a tone language like Chinese. So that's the research questions that we started out with. Okay, this is the production experiment. What we did, we created these contexts for information-seeking questions and for rhetorical questions and for polar questions and WH questions. And here, and that's why I was giving you the introduction to the differences in meaning at the very beginning of the talk. Here we make use of that. So the context for information-seeking questions always includes something like "you would like to know," and that's because, you know, the answer is not in the common ground. There is uncertainty on the part of the speaker, so that's what the context here tries to bring across. So you would like to know. And the context for rhetorical questions includes something like "it is known that," because remember, for rhetorical questions, the answer is already in the common ground, so it's already known. Yes, and then we have polar questions and WH questions. And the way this experiment, so the context was presented on the screen, either the rhetorical one or the information-seeking one. Then participants saw the question and were asked to read it out loud in a natural way. For the prosodic analysis, we were interested in these parameters. So first of all, we looked at the edge tones, so the terminus of the utterance, so whether it's a rise or a fall. And here I would like to say that, so we started out looking at rises and falls, of course, and if you look at the semantic literature, at least up to a certain point, that's what they say is the main difference between information seeking and rhetorical questions. So the assumption there is, because rhetorical questions are assertion-like, they have this feel of an assertion, we will find a fall in the end, because assertions normally fall, so we expect a low boundary tone for rhetorical questions as well. It's not as easy as that, as simple as that, as we will see as we go along. So looking at the edge tone, then we looked at the nuclear accents, the shape of the most prominent accent, we looked at the prenuclear field, and of course also the nuclear contour overall. For the tone language standards Chinese, we looked at F0 related characteristics and global characteristics of the F0 contour and also local characteristics. And then for the phonetic analysis, we studied duration and voice quality, and not only breathy versus modal, but we also included glottalized voice. So here are the most important results of this production experiment. And when I say only the most important, this is really what I mean, because there's so many different results in that experiment that I could actually spend hours talking just about that. So beginning with the edge tone in intonation languages, we find low edges across the board in Icelandic. That's not very surprising. And then for German and English, we find differences between information seeking and rhetorical questions, but only in polar questions. So the WH questions are normally falling, but we find a difference between within polar questions. And interestingly, this is not a difference between a fall and a rise, but it is a difference between two kinds of rises. One is the rise to a plateau, that's the rhetorical question, and then we have a steep rise in information-seeking questions. And if we take, let's take English here, so the information-seeking question is the gray one. We see 82% of these high rises, deep rises, and for rhetorical questions, it's far less. And then for this is the plateau here, so we get a lot more plateaus in English than in rhetorical questions than in information-seeking questions, and we get a very similar pattern in German as well. So once again, this is a difference not between a fall and a rise, but between a plateau and a steep rise. And here's an example from German, if you would like to listen to it. So I play the polar information-seeking question first, and then the string-identical polar rhetorical question. If I can, hang on, I have to move the pictures here so that I can actually, yeah, okay. So this is the information-seeking questions.
Ist denn jemand Garnelen?
And this is the rhetorical question.
Ist denn jemand Garnelen?
So I guess what you hear, at least that's what it is that the rhetorical question is lower overall, but there is also this plateau in the end as compared to the information-seeking question. So that's edge tones. Now moving on to the nuclear accent. There are two properties of the nuclear accent that are relevant here. One is the position of the nuclear accent, and the other one is the type of nuclear accent. And the position of nuclear accent is actually only relevant, that's what we found, in English of the languages that we tested. And the difference is within polar questions, and it's such that in information-seeking question, we get the default position of the nuclear accent at the end of the utterance. But in rhetorical question, I think it was about 25% of rhetorical questions, we get a early nuclear accent on the subject. And when I say 25%, you may say that, well, that's not that many, but you never really find an information-seeking question. So if you do have the accent in that position, then that's a very clear indicator of a rhetorical question. And I play these out to you just for you to compare. So this is now I have to move this thing again here. Okay, so the information-seeking question.
Does anyone wear linen?
And then the rhetorical question.
Does anyone wear linen?
And you can hear that the nuclear accent in rhetorical question is quite early. The other aspect of the nuclear accent is the type of the nuclear accent. And by that I mean two things. One is whether it's a monotonal or bitonal nuclear accent. So monotonal is to compare this H star here with starting from not so very low in the speaker's range, and compare this to a real rise, so bitonal accent L plus H, where we start lower here. But also there's alignment of the tonal targets within bitonal accents is relevant. So if you compare B and C, we have pretty early alignment here of L, and then alignment of the H within the syllable, within probably the vowel here of the stressed syllable. So this would be L plus H star. And then we have alignment of H early after the stressed syllable, and later alignment of L, and that would be L plus H star in German. So this difference is relevant in all the languages, in all the intonation languages that we tested. So here's an example from Icelandic. The first one is an information-seeking question, and the second one is a rhetorical question. And I hope that you hear the difference. So we get L star plus H in the information-seeking question. That's the first one. So this thing here is the stressed syllable, and then the peak is reached much later than the stressed syllable. Whereas in rhetorical questions, the peak is actually reached in the stressed syllable of the word. And this is how it sounds, Icelandic. Something like, does anybody read novels?
Les einhver novelur?
And this is the rhetorical question.
Les einhver
So there the
novelur?
rise is in the stressed syllable. You can also hear other prosodic parameters, but that's what we have in mind here. So alignment is relevant. So this is just an overview. In English WH questions, the main difference is between monotonal accent H star and bitonal accent L plus H star. And in English polar questions, we don't find this difference really. In German WH questions, the main difference is between the bitonal accents that are aligned in different ways. And in polar questions, again, the difference is between monotonal and bitonal pitch accent. So what you can see here for German, and we'll stick with that a little bit, what you can see is that the L star plus H is the accent that we find mostly in rhetorical questions. So that's like a typical rhetorical accent, if you like. There is only one thing that needs to be noted here. So if you look at this is repeating from an earlier slide. So if you look at the standard L star plus H accent that we find in German normally, do you see that H is, so L is aligned within the stressed syllable and H is aligned a little bit earlier in the next syllable typically. But what we find in these rhetorical L star plus H accents is it's a different kind of alignment. So the L is later than in the L plus H star, and it's about the same place as in the L star plus H. But the H, the peak, is aligned earlier. So the peak is also aligned in the stressed syllable. So what we find in these rhetorical questions is that both targets within this bitonal pitch accent are actually aligned within the same syllable. I have sound files here. So this is a WH information seeking question. The first one, play to you.
Wer ist ein Limburger? Wer ist ein Limburger?
And the second one is the WH rhetorical question.
Wer ist denn Limburger? Wer ist denn
So the
Limburger?
rise well, it's both earlier and also it's in the same syllable. So the rise is somehow compressed to be happening in the same syllable. We have carried out an imitation study to see whether participants would actually reproduce this kind of accent, because it's not something that has been described in the literature before. And I won't have time here to go into this, but I do have slides. So if you're interested in this, I can tell you more about it in question time. Still sticking to our F0 prosodic parameter, we're going to look at the prenuclear region now. And here what we can say, just very generally, if we find differences between information seeking questions and rhetorical questions in the prenuclear area, then it always goes in the same direction, and that is that we get more prominence or more prenuclear accents in rhetorical questions than in information seeking questions, and also what we call stronger here, so more bitonal than monotonal pitch accents, for example, in rhetorical than in information seeking questions across the languages that we tested. Moving on to Chinese, here we also have differences in F0 such that information seeking questions are overall higher than rhetorical questions, as you can see here. So this is across the whole contour, a global characteristic. And then if we zoom in this is to the end of the utterances, to the object of the utterance or the last syllable there. Here you can also see that information seeking questions are locally also higher in F0, except for tone 3, which is a little bit special. Okay, moving on to the phonetic parameters. First of all, duration. Here we get generally longer utterance or constituent durations in rhetorical questions than in information seeking questions. That is something that we find across all the languages that we've tested. They're generally faster, so rhetorical questions are generally faster. Information seeking questions are generally faster in speaking rate than rhetorical questions. Here's just an example from Chinese, where we have the duration of all the individual constituents in one sentence. Rhetorical questions are gray, information-seeking questions are white, and you can see that the duration is longer in rhetorical questions across all these constituents, except for the final particle in polar questions. Moving on to voice quality. Now, voice quality is interesting. we get different patterns here. We do find differences in all the languages though. So first of all, we find overall more breathy voice in rhetorical questions than in information-seeking questions in both German and English. I have an example here. The example is braucht denn jemand Schablonen, which means something like does anybody need gorges? So what you will hear is that we have more breathy voice in the beginning of the utterance in German. So this sound file, it would be the information-seeking question first, followed by the rhetorical question.
Braucht denn jemand Schablonen? Braucht denn jemand Schablonen?
So more breathy voice in the beginning, more breathiness in the beginning of the utterance. For Icelandic, the picture is different. Here, first of all, we also find more breathy voice, but this time at the end of the utterance. So mainly on or even just after the last syllable. And it goes together with glottalization. So we have glottalization kind of as a boundary marker in Icelandic. So we have a lot of glottalization going on at the end of utterances across utterance types. So in information-seeking questions and in rhetorical questions. But then we also have more breathy voice following that or overlapping with that glottalization at the end of the utterance. So once again, rhetorical questions are gray. So you can see that both in polar and WH questions, we have a lot of glottalization in both rhetorical and information-seeking questions. But if you look at the breathiness, we find a lot more breathiness in rhetorical questions than in information-seeking questions. And remember, unlike in German and English, this is at the end of the utterance. So here's an example from Icelandic, information-seeking question first.
Hver vill kamelute?
And the rhetorical question.
Hver vill kamelute?
Okay. Yeah, voice quality is also a cue to rhetorical meaning in Chinese, where we get more glottal voice in rhetorical questions than in information-seeking questions. And again, tone 3 is a little bit special here, just like with the F0 level. So this was just, I know it was fast and it was quite a few points of, that I made here. So just to sort of wrap it up, all languages use prosody to signal the differences between information-seeking questions and rhetorical questions. One thing, and I like to repeat this because this refers to the semantic literature really. So the boundary tone is not the only difference between information-seeking questions and rhetorical questions, of course, and sometimes, like in Icelandic or in WH questions in German and English, is not even relevant at all. All languages make use of F0 related properties and also temporal properties and also voice quality, and the ways in which these cues are used are language specific to a certain extent. For example, remember the differences in pitch accents, where we have different pitch accent types in between the languages, but within the languages, they are used to distinguish between rhetorical and information-seeking meaning. In tone languages, F0 is also a cue to meaning, so the ISQ is generally higher. And this, of course, all of these results are in line with a lot of the literature. So for example, the F0 results here for standard Chinese are in line with results for Cantonese, recent results for Cantonese, for example. And they're also in line, of course, with results about the globally raised F0 in interrogatives as compared to statements. So remember, if rhetorical questions have are assertion-like, have this feel of assertion, then it's not surprising that in the prosody they behave somewhat similar. Of course, they do not behave in the same way, but at least the tendency that rhetorical questions are lower as compared to information-seeking, just like statements are, makes sense. For duration, all the languages make use of duration. They all go in the same direction, longer durations in rhetorical questions. And again, this is in line with a lot of the literature, where there was where the literature tested differences between statements and interrogatives, not rhetorical questions. And also voice quality, although there are these language specific differences, all languages make use of voice quality. All right, so for German, moving on to the Corpus study now, for German, we wanted to test whether we can verify these results for the lab data also in spontaneous data. So what we did was we looked at a German TV cooking show, it's called Kitchen Impossible, and we took the data from 9 speakers, all of them were chefs. And we extracted rhetorical questions that they uttered. We excluded all the other question types that we didn't look at in our labs, in our production experiments that we did in the lab. So we excluded tag questions, declarative questions, and so on, and only included polar questions and WH questions. And what we find here is that the results are generally very similar, fortunately, to the lab data. The difference is, of course, that there is more variation in spontaneous speech than there is in lab speech. But again, what we find here, like with the German lab data, is that rhetorical questions most often have this L star plus H nuclear accent in both polar and WH questions. That's the accent that I was telling you about earlier. We also find similarities in edge tone. So in polar questions, we again find this difference between the steep rise in steep rise in information-seeking questions and the plateau rise in rhetorical questions. And there is some more variation within WH questions, where, remember, we had falling WH questions, or mostly falling in lab data, whereas in spontaneous speech we have more rises in information-seeking questions, information WH-seeking questions. But that's not surprising. We also know from the literature that there are actually quite a few rising WH questions in German spontaneous data. The difference here is between information-seeking questions and rhetorical questions is that we don't find these rises in rhetorical questions. Okay, and also, and this is really something that we find across the board, a slower speaking rate in rhetorical questions than in information-seeking questions in the spontaneous data. So these results very nicely confirm the lab data, and it's always, of course, very nice to have spontaneous data confirming lab data, or the other way around, to see that they are not completely different, which would be a bit worrying. Okay, so I look at my watch and I see that we still have some time, so I can take you quickly through the syntax experiment that we did. So the reason why we call it syntax experiment is that what we did was, this time we presented not the whole question, but we presented sentence fragments, and we wanted participants to put these sentence fragments together to form a sentence, and then to see how or what they actually did. So would they actually use an interrogative in the first place, or would they actually form some other sentence types? That was the original question. So what do they do in an information-seeking question and in a rhetorical question context? So how do participants form these utterances from the fragments that they see on the screen? So the contexts here were the same as in the production experiments. The questions were presented as fragments, and of course they were intended WH questions and intended polar questions, and in the intended WH questions, the pronoun, the WH word, was also presented. So it looked like this. So you see the context, the translation is at the top here. You see the context on the screen. So this is a neutral question, information-seeking question. And then you see these two, the verb and the object, also presented on the screen, and you are asked to form a sentence out of that. And here, of course, the intended utterance is a polar interrogative. For WH questions, again, you see the context, just like before, and then you see these sentence fragments. This time, the WH question word is included, so you have 3 fragments on the screen. So we were a bit ambivalent about whether or not to present these question words, because on the one hand, of course, if you do want to elicit WH questions, then you have to somehow tell them that they should produce WH questions, so you want to present or include the question word here. On the other hand, of course, that also limits the choices for the participants, so they're not completely free anymore in forming whatever sentence form they want to form. So we were a little bit ambivalent, and you'll see in the results that that really made a difference. Okay, so we tested overall 23 participants, 17 of which entered the analysis here, and they formed these questions. So we got 135 polar questions, information seeking, 49 rhetorical. And if you compare the numbers here between polar and WH questions, what you can see is that there were a lot more WH questions. And what this means is that a lot of the intended polar questions were where the participants only saw the verb and the object were actually not formed as polar questions, but were formed as WH questions. And this is a result that we were not that surprised about, because we had this intuition within our research group that maybe polar rhetorical questions are not as natural as WH rhetorical questions for whatever reason. So we weren't so surprised to find more WH questions here, or to find intended polar questions realized as WH questions. So I'll take you to the prosody results first. So what we find here, some of the typical results that we also had in the other two experiments. So in WH questions, a lot of falls in the rhetorical questions and more rises in the information seeking questions. So that fits in nicely with the results from the Corpus study. And looking at the nuclear accent, again, we find a lot of monotonal, low, so L star accents in information seeking, polar and WH questions, but then we get this rise here, L plus H star, or L star plus H really, in rhetorical questions that we also found in the other experiments. The speaking rate is always faster in information seeking questions. That's also the case here. So pretty much very, very similar results to the other two experiments, especially to the spontaneous data that we also found. So here's an example from this data set. So this is the information seeking WH question.
Wer studiert Algebra?
And this is a rhetorical WH question.
Wer liest denn Romane?
So you can hear difference in the edge tone, for example. There is also this difference in the nuclear accent. So just very quickly, I know this is a prosody series, but just very quickly, because it's interesting also just to see the syntactic results. I already mentioned that intended polar questions weren't necessarily produced as polar questions. So what we see is that, so match and mismatch. So match means intended polar question was also produced as a polar question, and mismatch means intended polar question was produced as a WH question. And the interesting result here is that the intended polar question was produced as a WH question, or as something else at least, mostly WH questions, more in the rhetorical meaning than in the information seeking meaning. And for WH questions, we don't find so many mismatches. That's of course because the WH pronoun was actually presented on the screen. We also find differences in other areas of syntax. So for example, we find more complex WH phrases like who of you, for example, in information seeking questions than in rhetorical questions. This DIP here is a discourse particle. So we find more discourse particles in rhetorical questions than in the information seeking questions. This is within WH questions here. So we do find syntactic differences as well, or lexical differences in this case, and they all go in the direction of what we also find in the literature. Okay, this is just a distribution of discourse particles, but I don't think I will have time to go into this. So this is my, I think, the last slide. So what we'll, or maybe two more. So one thing that we are still interested in that we haven't really had time to go into with this syntax experiment is the question of whether or not there is a trade-off between prosodic means on the one hand and non-prosodic means on the other. So for example, if you have a complex WH phrase, which sort of indicates already that it's information seeking, then do we need less prosodic marking? Or if we have these lexical means like lexical particles in our rhetorical questions, then do we need less prosodic marking for rhetorical meaning? Our intuition is, before we actually start to analyze this in much more detail, our intuition is that we don't. The intuition is that these means sort of add up, that we have lexical means, syntactic means, plus the prosodic means that don't disappear just because there is a lexical particle or something. Okay, so this is really the last slide. we have prosodic marking of rhetorical questions in all the languages that we've studied so far. And also, I should add here, in all the languages that other people have looked at, like Eva-Lina Asu in Estonian with her team, and then the work that I showed to you in Cantonese, and also there's a team working on French. So in all these languages that people have looked at, we find prosodic marking of rhetorical questions. The languages use the same phonetic parameters across the board, so F0, duration, and voice quality, but some of them are language specifically used, so especially F0 and voice quality. Duration seems to go in the same direction across languages. All of these results sort of fit in with previous results on questions versus statements in a variety of languages. So now what we have to look at is the difference actually between rhetorical questions and statements, and also other utterance types like exclamatives, for example. And I can tell you about work done by a PhD student of ours who compared rhetorical questions and information-seeking questions and exclamatives, and found that all three of them are different, with exclamatives at one end and information-seeking questions on the other hand, at the other end, and then rhetorical questions sort of in between, which makes sense because rhetorical questions have interrogative syntax after all, whereas exclamatives don't. So you would expect that rhetorical questions sort of are in between these two, but we need more research on this. Okay, so for German, we also showed that prosodic marking is basically the same with some more variation in spontaneous speech, but it's basically the same in lab speech and spontaneous speech. And we've also kind of shown, although the correlation there has yet to be determined, that we do get prosodic marking also in combination with syntactic and lexical means. And that's the end of the talk, not the end of the story. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. So now we will have the question and answer session starting. The first question comes from Cedric Patin from University of Lille.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi, Cedric. Hi.
Thank you for this really interesting talk. Maybe you mentioned it in your introduction and I missed the information. What about the intensity? Because I don't know the literature, but I suppose in French, my feeling is that I will add quite a strong intensity on the WH word in rhetorical questions. And I was wondering if it may have an impact on the abrasive voice or even duration, if there's something like this.
Yeah, so we didn't actually look at intensity in any detail, so we didn't really study it, but I can tell you from Chinese, for example, that there are differences in the realization of the WH pronoun, which sort of go into that direction. But for the other languages, we haven't really looked at intensity. So I really can't answer that question because we don't have any data. Sorry.
Thank you. No problem, of course.
No, there's reasons for, for why I'm sure it's possible technically, but the data that we have is of course a mixed pot, and so yeah, intensity has its problems, and but we only looked at these three parameters really: F0, duration, and voice quality.
Thank you.
The next question comes from Beste Kamali. Oh, can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
Nicole, thank you. It was very nice and detailed. I have a few questions, but in the interest of time, I'll ask one and wait for my turn again in case there's time. So I was wondering, what do you think about the possibility that rhetorical question prosody, especially rhetorical question prosody, could be one core prosody, and then there's conventional delivery style prosody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Rhetorical questions mostly have to be sarcastic and this and that. Like in your first experiment, especially I was worried that your context made it obvious that it's delivered in semi-secrecy.
Mm-hmm.
But then the others aren't like that, so that's a good sign. So the data is not, you know, a relic of the method. But there's still this kind of, there seems to be a delivery.
I know. Yes.
Stand-up comedian, for instance, would use rhetorical questions a lot, and they would shout it a lot, aloud. Yeah, who eats shrimps? Am I right? You know. So, what do you think of this, and any ideas how to test this kind of possibility?
Yeah. So that's actually, thank you for this. This is actually very many points in one question. So first of all, and I should have said it maybe in the main talk. So first of all, we are not claiming, not yet at least, that there is a special rhetorical prosody. So everything that we find might just be a non-default prosody, marking rhetorical questions in a context where, you know, you want to mark something as rhetorical, but you're using prosodic means that you could also use elsewhere. That's why this comparison between rhetorical questions and exclamatives is so interesting, because there, of course, you could say, okay, exclamatives have to be marked as well, and they're using some of the same means, but to a different extent. And we are still testing, you know, whether we are using the same cues, the same parameters to different extents across utterance types, or whether the parameters are differently specified, or what it is. But we can't claim at this point that we have a really special rhetorical accent, for example, although I was telling you about this L plus, we call it a bracketed accent, so L plus H, and then the whole thing has a star because it's all in one star. So, but again, this accent might occur elsewhere, which we haven't found out yet, but it doesn't occur in these information-seeking questions. So that's the comparison there. Another aspect, of course, that you mentioned is about attitudes. So sarcasm, surprise, and rhetorical questions have a lot of this in, you know, many instances, and we are very aware of that. We try to put together our contexts in such a way that they don't have too many of these attitudes. So we really try to be careful about, you know, things like irony, sarcasm, and so on. But there is work done in Denmark that looks at this in particular. So Olli Nibo's team, they are looking at attitudes as well in similar contexts, and they do find, you know, that they are marked. But we were trying to control for that. But of course, in real life, and that's the next aspect, in real life, or in special situations, like in parliamentary speech, or as you said, with comedians, of course, there you have a different register again. And my intuition would be that you're using a lot of the same prosodic cues that I was telling you about, but again, maybe to a different extent, maybe to an exaggerated extent in some way or another. But I would be surprised to find a lot of differences in terms of, you know, they use completely different pitch accent types, or all of a sudden they have these high rises in rhetorical questions all over the place. That would be surprising as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, I hope that this answers your questions.
Yes,
because
it does.
So many aspects.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next question comes from Katarina Lee from University of Cambridge.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. My question is about how to make sense of the voice quality data. So in terms of pitch and duration, like it really makes sense that rhetorical question behaves more like the statements, not the questions. But for the voice quality, I wonder, like, how would you explain like why people tend to use breathy data, or why people tend to use more glottals? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, thank you. So why they use more glottalized voice in one language and breathy voice in another language, that I can't tell you. But we do find these differences. So breathiness, I don't know where to start. This is such a big question. So one aspect of this is, so if breathiness is used, or at least a different kind of voice quality is used to mark rhetorical meanings, so one of the questions is, of course, whether that's a phonetic parameter that makes a difference in meaning, whether that's phonological then. But I think that's not your question. Your question is really, so how is that used, or why is it used? So I think it's just one of these parameters that are being used. So for breathy voice, if I can talk as a speaker of German who would use breathy voice, I think it comes with a little bit of more emphasis, maybe more being involved and so on, and that being reflected in your speech. Now, the question is, why do you find the differences between the languages? So why is there more breathiness in the beginning of the utterance in German, but at the end of the utterance in Icelandic, for example? And here I think it goes together with other functions of voice quality in these particular languages. We actually also find a little bit of breathy voice towards the end of the utterance in German, but more so in the beginning. So why that's being done, I think the question is probably not so different from saying, why do you use a different pitch accent type, or why do you speak faster when you form an information seeking questions? I think it's just one of the phonetic parameters that we have in our inventory of parameters that we can make use of to tell the differences in meaning. And it's being used, and it's interesting that it's being used in the same directions, so across languages. So it's non-default, non-modal in rhetorical questions, and it's modal voice quality in information seeking questions, and I would expect also in neutral statements.
Yeah, thank you. The last question comes from Ingo Feldhausen from Universität Leuven.
Hi, Ingo.
Hello. Nicole, thanks a lot for your nice talk and the nice overview of what you have done so far. And I think it's really impressive. And so my question is, what I have seen here, so it's, if I understood it correctly, it's a phonetic presentation you gave here, a phonetic description of the data in the 4 different languages. So I'm kind of interested in which way, or have you thought about what does it mean for phonology? So what are aspects that you can associate to specific questions? And combined with that, have you thought of, I mean, this is a typical question for people working on production, doing production studies. In which way have you thought of doing perception studies? Because I'm interested in which way do these cues really tell a difference? Because when I listened first to the German information seeking question on slide 20, I was like, yeah, it's a question, but I could also use it as a rhetorical question. And then of course, on the next slide, you had the rhetorical question. For me, it was clearly rhetorical. So I wonder in what kind of phonological conclusions you draw out of your phonetic data.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting question, one that I'm thinking about all the time. So of course we have to. I know I'm a phonologist, you know, but no. But I mean, there's a crucial difference between the parameters really. So one is that, for example, F0, if you look in intonation languages, if you look at pitch accent types, of course, these things like, so these accent types like L plus H star or H star or L star or whatever, they are, of course, or that's the assumption, they might be part of the phonology. They are intonational categories. And as soon as you say that, then you might want to assume that they are part of your phonological representation. You have these accent type at your disposal. So you use them to tell the difference between different meanings, just like you use different word order or whatever. That is, in my view, different for the phonetic parameters, duration and voice quality, because it's not a priori a natural assumption, it seems, to say that voice quality is phonological. But as soon as we realize that voice quality does tell a difference between different kinds of meanings, then we have to think about whether maybe this phonetic realization may have its place in a phonological grammar, and that's something that we are going towards. I say carefully, because that's very much, of course, at the phonology phonetics interface, and it's an area of the phonology phonetics interface that hasn't been addressed in too many places, at least not to my knowledge. So that's something that we are looking at. So one thing, of course, so when I was telling you about this L+H bracketed accent, the question that we raised there also in our imitation study was whether or not it's a new category maybe, and that's of course is phonology. So do we have, besides L+H star and L star plus H, do we have a third category there of a bitonal rising accent or not? And that of course only makes sense to assume if participants are either, both really, both capable of producing it and also capable of using it both in production and perception. So we are testing that, and that leads to the other part of your question. We do have perception experiments, which I haven't reported here because I didn't have time, but we do have perception experiments testing some of these parameters. What we find there is that participants are capable of, even without the context, so just the prosodic cues are telling the difference between information seeking and rhetorical questions. And we also have this very recent imitation study where we find that, maybe I'll quickly, if I find it quickly, because I have it here somewhere. Yeah, so here, for example, we find that all three, so this is testing this bitonal rising pitch accent types, the three different ones, and you see the different ones here at the right-hand side. So we do find that participants are capable of reproducing them in an imitation study. What we don't yet know or can be sure about, and that's where we need a perception study, is whether that's phonologically real or whether they are just capable of reproducing these experiments. So in terms of perception, so we have been doing some pilot studies that all sort of confirm that listeners make use of these prosodic cues that we find in production to tell the difference between the two elocution types. But we are currently planning, and this is something that I have to say with a smile because it's so big that we call it monster. We call it a monster experiment. So what we are planning to do and are piloting at the moment is to put very many of these cues into one experiment. So we are trying to manipulate, so alignment, we are trying to manipulate voice quality and duration, and then the two different meanings, and alignment in at least five conditions and so on, but it all adds up because we want it all in one experiment to see what the participants actually do with it. But it adds up to very many conditions. I think we are planning with about 84 conditions or 86 conditions at the moment, and that's of course, that's why we call it monster, right? I don't want to do the statistics for that. But yeah, that's going to be huge. But that's the only way of being in a position to say which of these cues are really relevant, which of these cues can maybe be left out. So when you said the information seeking question sounded like a rhetorical one, yeah, maybe yes, maybe you can do that in certain contexts. I would say it's maybe not the rule, but I would also say that if you have a very good context which tells you, yeah, now what is coming is a rhetorical question, maybe you don't need all these prosodic cues. So we have to, test that's for the future. But adding the context would mean 86 times 2 at least. Well, yeah. All these different conditions. That's our monster. Yeah, you'll hear about it. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for the Q&A session. And thank you for the exciting discussion that happened after the talk. We are slightly over time, but let's thank Nicole one more time. Thanks.
Thank you
for the wonderful talk.
I stopped sharing my screen.
Yes. We can now stop the recording.